At the core of everyday curriculum practice in early childhood education lies the concept of the child. Who we think children are and what we think childhood is will profoundly influence how early childhood educators go about their work. The decisions they make about what's included, what's excluded, who's involved, who's not involved, and how the curriculum is experienced by children on a daily basis. This work around theorising images of childhood is ongoing, and it's very provocative work that sometimes is seen as somewhat controversial. There are many people who have a stake in keeping children conceptualised in certain kinds of ways. For example, the conceptualisation of a child as an innocent being needing protection from the nasty world is very dominant in our society, and is one that keeps children out of many activities, experiences that they may well have a legitimate right to participate in. For example, in everyday life in the streets and in our parks, children have participation entitlements that are often not acknowledged. Other dominant frames around images of the child, constructions of childhood, include that of the child as a threat. And we see that surfacing often in discourses around behaviour management and treating behaviour as something that is inherently within the child rather than a consequence of both context and children's characteristics. So I'm very interested in contesting that notion. It's very easy to blame the child for veering off the path of what's considered appropriate childlike behaviour. There's been some great work done in Australia and internationally on constructing childhood images and deconstructing childhood images, and some of my early and very pleasurable deconstruction was taken with a person called Patricia Holland, who wrote a lovely book called What is a Child, in which she assembled a lot of popular culture photographs of children in advertisements, magazines and so on, and then analysed how children and families were being positioned by these photographs. She called on a post-structuralist discourse to perform that analysis, and I used her work to perform an analysis of some of the work of Anne Geddes. And it's been a very provocative activity to critique those dominant images of children and childhood. The third dominant construction of childhood, I believe, is the child as an embryo adult. And you see that playing out in Saturday morning dance classes pretty strongly, where children are being prepared for their future lives. So even if they're not going to be ballerinas, they are going to learn the discipline of practice and rehearsal. There's a lot of pressures on young children, and there's a lot of pressures on child educators to prepare children for life. That always makes me laugh, because I think, is childhood not life? What is it? This idea that the children are embryo adults that have to be prepared. I mean, the homework discourse is a really strong one around that construction, that children need homework in kindergarten because it gets them into the habit of doing homework for when they have to do it later. And this seems to be a really powerful mobiliser for families to spend enormous amounts of money on education gains, on the best schools and early years education programs, and for schools and business councils and employers to have a say in what should be in early years curriculums. So that too is one that I think deserves pretty solid critique every so often. But you certainly see it playing out in school curriculum right now.
So one of the things that thinking with Deleuze about lines can do is to bring together two unlikely possibilities. And he uses the metaphor of a sheet of paper. If you think of a square piece of paper and you look at the diagonal corners, it's easy to think, well, there's no way that you can bring those corners together. But he says, if you fold the piece of paper, then that's a very easy way to bring together two corners, two different perspectives that you may not have thought about before. And that idea is useful in all sorts of ways. It was very useful in thinking in relation to the EYLF about how we might work with policymakers who can have very different views about curriculum. But it's also been helpful very recently for me in a research project where we wanted to try to understand infants' perspectives on their days in family daycare and long daycare centres. So we used that idea of the fold to bring together the notion of babies being able to use cameras to record what was of interest to them, a team of researchers, and also babies' lines of sight. We found a way, with babies' informal permission, to be able to attach a camera to a hat or a headband that they would wear on their forehead, so that we were able to track what it is that they were particularly interested in. Later, for some of the older babies, we were able to have them sit on a lap and actually watch some of the footage of what they were looking at, but also at the same time we had photographed what the babies were looking at from behind them. So we were able to use a split screen and to actually have a baby sitting in our lap looking at that footage. And there was a lot more to it than that, obviously, in terms of then trying to interpret what the baby was thinking about, interested in. However, it did open up all sorts of possibilities that we hadn't thought about originally. So that's just one example that's been really illuminating for me.
We've done a lot of work in early childhood over the past 20 years in terms of understanding gender and how it's constituted in young children. The work of Bronwyn Davies, McNaughton, a whole range, Alloway, there's a whole range of people who have operated around gender. And that has been really important work to understand how particular ways of doing gender, they start in early childhood. They start well and truly way before you're born, in terms of the way that you are then primed into a particular type of performance around your gender. What has been, I feel, problematic about that is that we've only ever got half the story. In understanding gender, we have to look at the way that certainly the way that's constructed, even in early childhood, is the way that it's constituted within a heterosexual framework. And we can't understand the nuances of gender without looking at that link between the way that it is constituted within heterosexuality. And we haven't done a whole lot of work on that. And I guess that's where I've been particularly interested, is that I want to know how we as a group of people, a society, constitute young people in a particular way around gender. And we haven't gone there around the sexuality bit because of the way that sexuality is actually constituted as a taboo with young children. You put childhood and sexuality in the same breath, and you're creating a controversy immediately. And all we've got to do is look at the moral panic that has actually been associated with various pieces of work that, in more recent years has led to major controversies when we've actually started to talk about that particular area. And what has happened is that through that process we haven't gone there because it's too risky, it's too controversial, and so in some respects we haven't looked at the 100% picture of what it means to be a gendered child, and how that construction is linked to the way, not only the way you perform your gender, but the way that you see yourself as a sexual being. And you know, that stuff starts early in life. You're already constituted. You know, people say, well, yeah, children are too young to talk about sexuality. Well, we're already doing it with them. And we're doing that because it's a normalised context of heterosexuality. And it's so normalised that we don't even think about the way that gender is constituted within that heterosexual framework. And so it's only when we actually stop and think about that that the complexities of the way that young people see themselves, I guess, not just as gender beings, but as young people who have a sense of desire. And our sense of desires are certainly constituted not just physically, but certainly constituted socially as well through the construction of genders and what is perceived to be appropriate relationships or appropriate desires to have. And that, you know, like young people and grow up, I guess, sort of trying to negotiate different sorts of feelings that they have when that desire is perceived not to be the appropriate desire. And that's when you start to feel, well, you know, is there something wrong with me, or is there, you know, something unnatural about me? So for going back and looking at the way that we heterosexualise gender through the process of normalised behaviours in early childhood. Well, it's normal for a young boy and a young girl to chase each other and want to kiss each other and play kiss and chase, and to play sort of mummies and daddies, and to play girlfriends and boyfriends. That's a sort of natural thing to do. One expects that because it's perceived to be the biological natural thing. But we don't step back and say, well, okay, is this really natural? Is this something that's inherently biological? Or is it that we actually just allow that to happen, believing that, well, this is the natural, normal things for kids to do? But when kids start to do the other thing, when kids, you know, the little boy wants to marry the other little boy, we're very, very, very quick to point out, well, no, that's not possible to do. Or we start to worry in that process. Or we've got the young little girl, for example, who wants to marry her girlfriend, or the most important, has a desire in some way for someone who's a girl. We're very, very quick to say, well, hang on a sec, that's an inappropriate desire. And you have to, there's one natural and normal way of doing this process of sexuality, and this is what it is. And we start to worry about children who don't fit into that sort of normal way of being there. And that's also, it's also related to, I've had a lot of interest in recent years with people coming and saying to me, I've got a boy or I've got a girl who doesn't like to be what we think to be their normal genders. They want to be more feminine, or they want to be girls who wear boys' clothes, or they want to experiment more. They want to be less confined to those traditional ways that we have constituted masculinity and femininity. And what we've done is that they become the problem, that they become harassed. Because they're policed by not just adults, and just not adults in, say, perhaps parental roles, but adults on the outside who think, well, gosh, that little girl shouldn't be wearing those clothes, or that little girl's too much of a tomboy, or that little boy's playing with a doll over there, he should be out with a ball, or whether it's teachers, or whether it's other kids themselves. We have a whole range of kids out there who are challenging the boundaries of gender, and it's how we as individuals and as adults and as other children relate to that particular type of child who does that. We as adults, we challenge gender norms. Some of us get away with it, some others get harassed or perceived to be certain things. Children do the same thing. We as adults feel confined and regulated by gender in many different ways, so do they. And I think that it doesn't mean that they're going to grow up to be, gay or lesbian, or it doesn't mean, so what if it does? And it also doesn't mean that they're going to grow up to be a particular type of gendered being as adults. It means that they actually want to be less confined in what they perceive to be very, very rigid things, very, very rigid boundaries of what's possible for them. And some of them do it in private when they get a chance, because they know the gaze of others is so particularly policing. Or some of them actually have got enough sense of who they want to be very public about the way they do that. And how we regulate that becomes something that we need to think about, because I think that what happens is that we turn around and say, well, hang on a sec, that kid's got a gender problem, and we got rid of the homosexuality thing out of psychology, being psychotic label. We've now got this other sort of problematic label around kids who don't conform to their gender, and they're seen as being sort of psychologically potentially problematic. And I think that that's really inappropriate. It's a concern because parents will say to me, I want the best for my child. I don't care if my little boy wants to wear a ballet dress, or my daughter wants to wear an army outfit or whatever it might be, or even Superman, to me, it's really appropriate that they explore gender, and what we do is we cut that off at the knees. We stop it and we make them problematic.
Children have many different funds of knowledge that they acquire through interactions and experiences within their extended family and their local community. They bring those funds of knowledge with them to early childhood centres and to schools. It's the educator's responsibility really to find out about the funds of knowledge that children bring with them to the early childhood setting. So that means we need to take the initiative to talk to parents, not to wait for parents to come and approach us, and to understand that all children have strengths, all children have different funds of knowledge that they bring, and we need to value and respect and work with all those different funds of knowledge. What happens if we don't do that is that particular funds of knowledge are not valued, not respected. Those children's experiences become marginalised. So it's like saying, leave your language at the school gate. If we say, no, you can't bring your experiences with Arabic or your interest in Little Mermaid or Ben 10, then it's like in the past when we said, you can't bring your language to the centre. We need to allow children to bring what Pat Thompson calls their virtual backpacks into the classroom, into the centre, look at what's in those backpacks and work with it and build on it.
I think also the when we sort of focus too much on learning outcomes, we are limiting the learning of children because we're imposing our adult ideas of what they need to know in the future onto them. Now, I think that young children have as good an idea of knowing what it is that they need to know to find their way through the world as we as adults can have of telling them. After all, we're basing a lot of our thinking on our past experience, and how relevant is that to what's happening now in the 21st century, especially as things are moving at such an incredibly fast pace. And as far as thinking about young children knowing what it is that they need to know and sort of working with those understandings, think of young children and their ease with the digital world. Think about how they will take a remote control for something and they'll push every which button as a toddler to find out what happens. Think about the toddler who gets really irritated when you give him a remote that he knows doesn't make the television work. That's not the right remote. Think about the infant wanting to move, and how many stories do you hear of the first crawling movements that an infant made was to reach the TV remote that was sitting on the rug just out of reach. So what I'm suggesting is that rhizo thinking is a way of disrupting those unequal power relations that adults assume is their right with children. But I'm suggesting that children have rights for equitable relationships. And I also think the rhizo thinking helps us to understand the kinds of learning that goes on for young children that is really meaningful to them and helps them construct meaningful understandings of the world. We know that within the rhizo plant we cannot control the cultivation of a rhizome. We can just wait and see where it might pop up, and that there are certain conditions that allow it to grow and pop up in unexpected places in unexpected ways. So what might some of these rhizo conditions be in relation to young children and how they operate, how we encourage them to operate, and how they are learning in the world? My suggestion is that when they are operating in open spaces with open programs where they have time within any given day and time over extended periods of time, where those times are unhurried and uninterrupted, then the kinds of learning that occurs or emerges in those spaces is meaningful to the children. So the kinds of open, unhurried, uninterrupted spaces allows children to make meaning of their learning and to make that learning happen for themselves in meaningful ways. And I think of 2 4-year-old boys on a dinosaur hunt. Now they played hunting games day after day after day, and they would make maps of their hunt before they started. So they had a map of how they talked each other through how they thought the game was going to emerge that day and the kinds of spaces that they envisaged they would move through. It was also a way of sharing a script of what was going to happen. The map became a tool for their literacy and for their numeracy. The maps became ways of resolving conflict. There were moments when they would a particular moment when they obviously had a misunderstanding on a particular day as to whether this was a spider hunt they were on or a dinosaur they were on, and each of them had a different idea, and the idea had kind of changed, and it wasn't until they drew the map that it became obvious that one of them had a spider in his map and the other had a dinosaur. So there was a bit of argument there. And the most amazingly sophisticated piece of conflict resolution that I think I've ever seen. And so they decided in the end that it would be a spider dinosaur hunt. Even in moments when they didn't resolve their differences or the differences became too great and one of them moved away, it still moved them into a space where they could discuss those differences and find a way of working through them. Now, the learning that was happening for those 2 boys in those spaces was far better than any kind of learning that those children could have encountered at tabletop activities, in group discussions, or even in adults trying to mediate the situation for them.
Just in terms of the particular practice I mentioned of doing philosophy with children, the width is important, as I say. It's a Vygotskian width, unlike maybe the Lippmann program, which is wonderful in one sense, but is a set program. The children that I worked with in doing this type of practice, say 6-year-olds, and what I discovered with them, they sat and they talked about topics they liked or they wanted to talk about. And again, it's the role of the teacher, like Socrates, to build it, to lead it somewhere, to develop it further by putting out more questions or statements. And at one stage, this group of 6-year-olds were talking about, is it right to have animals in the zoo? And some of the children were very clear that it's very wrong to lock up animals. And others said, no, but I could never see an elephant if there were no elephants in Dublin Zoo and if it didn't exist. Now, as we were going round, a little boy had said that he liked going to the zoo and he liked the animals being there. And another little girl, Sarah Ann, had been very clear that it was wrong to lock any animal up and we shouldn't do it. And they weren't in the country where they wanted to be. And it came back to this little boy's turn. His name is Daniel. And he said, I would just like to say I disagree with myself, because when Sarah Ann said whatever Sarah Ann said, I think she's right. Therefore, I disagree with myself now. Now, that surprised me greatly. In fact, I nearly fell off my chair, because never in any sort of structured conversation in my adult life had I heard anyone say, I disagree with myself. And here the 6-year-old could do it very comfortably and very rightfully so. Now, I learned that from children, and I am very comfortable about saying, I disagree with myself, I think you have a point there. So I learned that, if you like, maturity of thought from a 6-year-old. And also some of the images that children come up with. And things like, again, about thinking in depth, where I heard a 5-year-old one time say in the classroom, again at a thinking time session, I wonder, do ants think flowers are trees? Now, if one was to stop and pause and think about that, again, is to reflect on these comments and images that children come up with, and to give them an opportunity to. And I've had many of those, many examples of those, about leaves tickling trees till may get them to wake up in the spring, and how the birds are the people that, or the creatures that tell everyone else that spring is coming, because they've got no roof on their house and they can see it coming first, so they tell. But I think as teachers we need to in some way take time, first of all, to allow this thinking and talk an opportunity to be expressed and respected, and then sometimes to reflect on it. Because if you take the first example I give you from a 5-year-old, I wonder, do ants think flowers are trees? Now, if you test that against PGT theory, it will undermine PGT theory on nearly every single front. So in that sense, if we can, and I'm sure every teacher that ever listens to this will have as many stories as I could give or examples. So I think we need to listen and analyse and reflect on those things.
Because I worked in occasional care, which was primarily to do with infants and toddlers, and then I also worked in family daycare as a child development officer, which also was really dominated by children under 3. I really wanted to know more about infant-toddler development and curricula that were appropriate for infants and toddlers. So I went off to America and did a summer school there in Boston at Wheelock College. And that was very much driven by developmental theory. So I learned a lot about infant-toddler development from a psychologist who'd actually worked with Jerome Kagan, and he came and gave a class on temperament. It was amazing. Just he spoke for a whole hour and didn't stop. So clear, wonderful speaker. Anyhow, that's just a little aside. Then I went and visited people down in the south. I learned about the ITERS, Infant Toddler Environment Rating Scale, that was just being developed by Thelma Harms and Debbie Cryer, Richard Clifford. They were working on that, and I visited the center at Frank Porter Graham where they were working. And then I was invited to go and visit a child care center in Washington. There was a woman that was running a child care center for the CIA, I think it was, or something like that. Anyhow, the security to get in and out of the center was extraordinary. But anyhow, so I was able to apply some of my observational skills. But she was the one that said, now you must go to California. She says it's very different in California, the way that they work with infants and toddlers. Their philosophy of early childhood is very different to what you're getting here on the East Coast, which was driven more by the sort of scientific study and developing ways to study and measure what was happening in early childhood services. So I went to Pacific Oaks College in Los Angeles, just outside of Los Angeles, where an amazing woman called Elizabeth Jones had been working for quite some time, Betty Jones, working with environments and how to set up environments for children, but particularly for infants and toddlers. So childcare settings that were comfortable and appropriate for the sort of movement skills and learning skills of very young children. And incredibly, at that same time, there was a workshop that Magda Gerber was giving for a week. So I was able to attend this workshop. I'd never heard of Magda Gerber before and her work. And it was just amazing to participate and learn her method and her ways of thinking about young children from her, face to face. Now, Magda Gerber, I think, is a much better known person nowadays. If you don't know that name, you would know Janet Gonzalez Mena and Ron Lally, both of whom are very well-known early childhood educators based in California, who were really influenced a lot by Magda Gerber's teaching. Magda Gerber is a Hungarian who came from Hungary and was teaching what was called, or initially developed as, the Pickler approach. Emmy Pickler worked in orphanages, in an orphanage, I guess, in Hungary, and her way of dealing with the difficulties there of a very, very bad staff-child ratio. So there might have been sort of 8 to 10 babies for every staff member, was partly what drove her to develop this approach that Magda Gerber taught us about. So she showed us a little bit about the orphanage, but basically it was her application of this way of thinking about young babies that was being applied into childcare settings that she was working with. So the key message of her teaching that stuck with me is this short phrase: never put a baby into a position that they can't get into themselves. And she illustrated that to us very well by asking us, to imagine that we were a 4-month-old baby and making us lie on our stomachs, which is often done, or certainly was then, to see what can you do as a 3 or 4 month baby lying on your stomach. Well, not very much at all. You can lift your head up for a while, but your head is very heavy. You can turn your head to the left and right. You have to have both hands on the floor because you need to keep yourself stable, but it won't last very long and you'll end up, flat on the floor with your head on one side, and you can see things that way. Imagine though that you're on your back. Roll over and lie on your back. Now how much can you move on your back? You can move your hands and your arms, you can move your legs, you can even reach your feet with your hands. You can look from left to right, you can look all around. You have so much freedom of movement in that position. And so that was the first lesson. If you want a baby to develop motorically, to have that confidence, that capability, that sense of themselves as strong and confident and able to do things, even at the age of 3 or 4 months, you give them the opportunity to lie on their backs. And then the child will twist and turn and start to roll over. So once the child can roll over themselves, and it does happen, and it's interesting to try that out, lie on your back and roll over really slowly and work out what are the motor skills you need to use to actually get into that prone position. You can roll over, but your arm gets stuck underneath. So you've got to be able to lift your body up and put your arm out. But once a child can do that, once they can comfortably roll over and get into prone position on their stomach and hold themselves up and roll back again, then no problem at all to put a baby into that position because they could get into it themselves. The same thing with sitting up. So once a child is able to push themselves up into sitting position, no problem. But if you just put a child in sitting position and plop them up with pillows and they haven't got there themselves, they're unsteady. They're not quite sure, how they're going to keep their balance. It's not a comfortable position to be in. And I think that was the main message, is for babies to be comfortable in the positions, and when they're comfortable, when they can get into those positions themselves, then they're able to explore confidently and feel confident about themselves. So she taught us that, and we all thought, yes, this is absolutely wonderful, makes perfect sense, we'll tell everybody to do this. And then, just out of the blue, a mother came into the building where the classrooms were being held, and she had a baby with her. And Magda Gerber invited her to come in, to give us an opportunity to see a real baby, and to sort of see some of these things. And the mother came in and had this very proud with her young baby and sat down and spoke to us. And what did she do? Put the baby on her stomach. And you could see everybody thinking, oh my God, she's put the baby on her stomach. She's not supposed to do that. She's supposed to put the baby on their backs, What's going to happen? So it was so interesting, all of us sitting around there being very quiet because Magda Gerber was in charge. And eventually, she spoke to her and talked to her, and gradually the mother did turn the baby over on her back, and at the end of, and then she finished and left and all of that. And of course, as soon as the mother had gone, we all blurted out, but she put the baby on her stomach. What? Why didn't you? And Magda Gerber very calmly gave us the other lesson about infants and toddlers, which is very much like Bowlby's lesson. You never interfere with the parent-child relationship. You never give the parent the idea that they're doing something inappropriate or wrong. You work with what's going on and introduce ideas or things very gradually. So this idea of learning from the expert and then hearing from the expert that you're not the expert was such a wonderful experience to have.
Families often consider educational activities as learning the things that perhaps were important for them as children themselves, that they felt they needed to learn. So the focus on colours and numbers and letters and writing your name and recognising letters, recognising words, being able to colour in, all of those kinds of things are seen as educational. For me, the most important thing that families do, for good, for bad, for whatever, is, and I think that the most important thing that educators should be doing too, is developing, enabling, I don't know the word, but thinking about the way children become learners and the things that, the dispositions that will support them as learners, as human beings in the world. So to be curious is a really important and wonderful thing. The first time I talked with a parent about curiosity, my very first learning was that the group of parents sat there and I said to them, how does your child show that they're curious? And they all sat there thinking, I don't know, because there has to be a right answer. And of course there isn't a right answer. And this wonderful parent said, Christopher's flushing socks down the toilet to see where they go. Is that being curious? And suddenly was born in my mind and this whole group of people's mind. Everybody fell about and said, that's really curious. Do we want him to do that? How else can we grow these curiosities? So that natural engagement, that the drive of curiosity that Christopher showed, and gosh, he's curious, became something around the everydayness of children's learning and the everydayness of the interactions that families can have to really support children's learning, as opposed to colours, numbers, colouring in, the computer game and so on. I think for years we've focused on a developmental view of education, of learning, of children growing, of families, of the role of families, of the role of parents. Parents understand that there are milestones. They've bought into that as being a really important issue. What I'm interested in working with families is moving away from that notion of a developmental view of the world and into a view of the world that's perhaps more socio-cultural, that's maybe more postmodern, but which enables them to think about what, in my opinion, matters so much more than, are we standing up at this point? Can we hold a pencil with a pincer grip? Can we, tripod grips, I don't even know. Can we do these tick boxy things that are skills but are not ways of being in the world? So I've learnt that from my own research, from my own thinking, but more importantly from the families with whom I've worked and with whom I've come to understand the notion of little narratives in a whole different way, that there are other ways of viewing children's learning, of viewing our roles, of viewing the role of being a parent, of viewing the role of being an educator, of viewing the role of community, of viewing our values for children, our beliefs about children, and our pulling together our hopes and dreams and aspirations in a way that is rich for families, that is rich for children, and that moves beyond ticking boxes and moves beyond a very narrow view of learning.
I did my PhD on communities of practice without knowing anything about communities practice when I did it, but that's one of the frameworks that I grabbed to help me understand what was happening. And what I was trying to do was understand how children learn new practices. How do they begin to know something they've never known before? And I guess the conventional way of thinking about that is that we tell them stuff, or we show them stuff, or we do stuff with them and introduce them to new ideas. We read them stories, we build up an idea of how this new thing might operate in the world. And that's a useful, I guess that's the way I went into my doctorate, understanding what learning was all about. It was very active and it was very engaged, learn by doing or whatever, more Piagetian way of looking at things. But then doing this doctorate gave me a whole new way of thinking about it. So in essence, what I did was take 5 children from a preschool or childcare center into a museum and look at how did they make sense of that new place? How did they learn how to engage in artwork and activities that the museum prized and valued and revered? And what I found is that the children brought the practices from the preschool with which they were very familiar and enacted those same practices in the museum where they were excluded from the museum. They got into trouble, they touched the alarms, they sat on a chair that was an exhibit. They were very alarmed by the fact that their little backpacks had to be put into the guards' cloakroom, where they weren't allowed to have them with them. All the things that you would take for granted at the preschool would be the way to engage with children were kind of flipped on their head. So those practices that were prioritized in the museum were the new practices, the new ways of being in that community that those children were beginning to learn. And to cut a very long story short, the fascinating thing was that when they came back to their preschool and enacted the practices that they'd learned in the museum, the things that they decided were most important about the museum community practice were all the guards, all the alarms, all the protective practices, because to their mind, that's what they were learning about that new community, that it's a place where there's a lot of rules. There's a place where you can't be a kid. You have to be contained. You can't touch things. You have to be quiet. And when they made their own little museum in the preschool, I asked them to do some paintings, perhaps. They'd like to do some paintings, something from the museum that they saw that they'd like to put into their own museums. And they painted a whole set of signs warning people what not to do in the museum. So that really was a much more useful way of understanding how learning was occurring, by them adopting and enacting and participating in the practices that they could sense were the most important in that museum. I took them to the children's part of that museum, and they really wanted to go there. But after the first visit, because we went on multiple visits, they didn't want to go there anymore. They wanted to go to the adults' museum. So even they could sense this being sequestered off as other in the children's section of the museum, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted to be part of the main community, and they knew that there was another community going on there, another whole sense of things happening there that they were being excluded from, not because people were trying to exclude them. I'm sure those museum professionals were trying to cater for children. You know, in their minds, that was a way to cater for children, to give them a place, to make them feel comfortable, where they could crawl around and jump and touch things. But the children somehow sensed that that wasn't what the community was really about. And they got the message despite, you know, that that child-centered or child-oriented, or what is it called? It's, yeah, developmentally appropriate practice, that's what it's called. And that's not what the kids wanted. Kids wanted the real thing. They got up on empty plinth sort of area where there would have normally been a statue or something, and they were jumping off of it and rolling around on it. And it looked so bizarre to my eyes and to the guard, you know, the security person's eyes. Because in museums, you don't see people rolling around and jumping, except maybe in one of Barbara Piscatelli's museums, where the children are out in the mainstream doing interesting things with adults. And the adults are doing things with kids. Yeah, very different way of looking at things.
I think in a way, children are the wonderful theorists.
Yes.
And that actually we can learn from observing their theorising and supporting it and respecting and honouring their intuitive theorising. And to me, that we should be carrying on that model of always seeking to gain greater insight and search for theoretical pathways that support that ongoing journey that we all are on.
Now, I have to quote Wordsworth here. In one of his poems, he says, "The child is father of the man."
Probably my work would be less known for critiquing DAP, although my edited book, Reconceptualizing the Early Childhood Curriculum, and an earlier journal by the same name, both really took up that issue. Many of my colleagues were foregrounding that issue, arguing that it was a universal discourse, that it came from very actually Eurocentric, middle-class, heteronormative assumptions about children, and that it privileged using stage-based development over other ways to understand children, sociologies of childhood, early work around childhood studies, etc. My work within that very quickly focused on the phrase children and families at risk, which I saw as even doing anti-racist work at the time, as thinly veiled new language for the notion of cultural deficits, a very ugly phrase that I would argue persists. The construction with children who bring, an array of different life experiences that may be considered not atypical in some way or out of the norm of dominant culture. And I came to that strong critique not on my own in an ivory tower, but because I was out there working with children and families. And what they were saying is, my goodness, my child is labeled at risk. I go to a program that my child in an urban school attends a program, and program for at-risk children and youth is on the door. They enter a door to have a learning experience in which the phrase at risk, which we all know means at risk for failure, is right in their face every day, and what can be done about that? And I said, we need to be speaking out about that. We need to be looking at other ways to frame not only children with that label, but all children. And so with Sally Lubeck in the mid-90s, after doing work on this for many years, we had a volume come out titled Children and Families at Promise, interrogating, deconstructing the discourse of risk. Taking that view of children at promise and children of value, and looking at all the ways in which phrases like early intervention, just programs addressing what are perceived as a lack of knowledge or ability, drawing on the work of Louis Moll and other colleagues who have written about funds of knowledge. I think that's such an important concept, to value the different forms of funds of knowledge that inform children and enrich their lives. Good gracious, in my work in sub-Saharan Africa for nearly 25 years, and just seeing all the cultural knowledge, all the deep knowledge that indigenous children have, that they can actually identify by about the age of 5, the characteristics of 100 or more animals that are part of their compound that they're to take care of and make sure nothing happens to, and they know which are theirs and which aren't. Just respecting so many different forms and funds of knowledge. I think that is right at the roots of how I've come to be into children's voice so very much. So it's partly a rights-based approach, and it's partly very much informed by cultural theories, and I'd say in particular funds of knowledge.